And now to our roundtable. We are joined by Colin Reed, who is the chair of the Economics and Finance Department at SUNY Plattsburgh, also a columnist for the Press Republican, and also Jay Bryant is a former business and economics writer who has recently retired as a columnist with the Montreal Gazette. Welcome to you both. We are taping a little bit earlier in the week. Congress is returning to work this week, and the Senate is scheduled to take up the long-stalled push to raise the federal minimum wage up to $10.10 an hour, up from the current $7.25. The president pitched this in his weekly radio address and has been pushing for this for a couple of years now. But the chances of this passing are pretty slim.
Almost none, especially through the Congress. Might have a little bit of a chance more in the Senate, but the Congress, I think, is really resistant. And I think that we should really go a little bit back to the drawing board. We all agree with the sentiment that that working family that's trying to support a couple of kids on minimum wage is just absolutely impossible these days. However, very little of that minimum wage increase will go to that important group that we need to support. Instead, for instance, a university might have a certain budget for student help. We'll simply hire fewer students if the rate goes up. Nonprofits are in that same sort of bind. So I think it's well-intentioned, but a relatively poorly targeted piece of public policy to really make the difference we all hope it could make.
And the Republicans are pointing to the Congressional Budget Office report that came out a few months ago, saying that it could cost the economy a 500,000 jobs, 500,000 jobs. The Republicans are pretty unified against raising the minimum wage in both the Senate and the House, and it won't even come up in the House.
No doubt.
This undoubtedly will become a campaign issue, though, and I think a lot of people suspect that's why the timing of this vote this week, as Congress returns, we're getting closer now to the campaigns gearing up for the midterm elections in November, and it's probably no accident that they're going to have a symbolic vote this week in the Senate.
A lot of what we know about this depends very heavily on who we ask. There are a number of very reputable economic studies that show that raising a minimum wage doesn't have much of an effect on jobs as long as it's done halfway intelligently. If you have a massive overnight raise, then yeah, it can have a real impact. But if you had, in the case of the federal minimum wage, a series of increases targeted to the cost of living, for example, over the years, then I think the evidence suggests very strongly that that would have been pretty much harmless. And it isn't entirely clear that the 500,000 jobs that might be lost would be lost overnight, and it isn't entirely clear that the raising of the minimum wage would not be a major boon to low-income families, even though the argument has been made that, well, most of the people making the minimum wage, for example, are part-time workers. Well, yeah, but a very large number of low-income families depend on part-time jobs because they can't get enough hours to be counted as full-time workers, so they're working at 3 part-time jobs. I find it very, very hard to argue against an increase in the minimum wage that would let people basically just survive in most U.S. states.
And the supporters argue that this would raise, what is it, just shy of a million families, I think 900,000 families above the poverty line. They're saying that would be one of the benefits here.
Yep. I mean, it is a problem to be raising it very substantially in one jump, as the Obama administration's trying to do. But what's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is that nothing has been done for so many years that people have been sinking deeper and deeper into poverty.
Yeah, so this would go $7.25 to $10.10 by 2016. A number of states are bypassing this process, New York among them.
Well, they're kind of supplementing it because federally regulated workers make up only, as we were talking about earlier, only a very small minority of the,
million,
yeah, so that's what's that 2.5 or 2% of the population, of the working population. So the folks regulated by states, I guess, would make up the vast majority of the population. And so it's a very good thing if the administration in Washington has managed to trigger something in a lot of states. They may get more people, in fact, they may already have quite a few more people who've had their minimum wage increased than they would have gotten if they were able to get through the federal proposal.
On the other hand, too, you might compare, if it's a federal policy that's going to apply equally to everybody, but an $8 an hour wage in Kansas might be equivalent to a $14 an hour wage in New York City. I just think we just need somewhat of a more nuanced approach. We might be able to do things like, for instance, have carve-outs for high school students and summer employment and that kind of thing to alleviate some of the $500,000 job estimate. There are things we can do to improve this, I think.
You do have a number of cities, speaking of that, you have a number of cities, Seattle and other major cities that are taking matters into their own hands and trying to set their own minimum wage trying to set their own minimum wages, basically. One state, I think, has taken steps, though, to try to stop that from happening, saying that they're not going to allow individual towns and cities to set the minimum wage. Whether it's Nebraska or Kansas, I think one of those states has made that move. Back to the fact that about it being a campaign issue, a Wall Street Journal poll shows, I think, about 58% of people saying they're going to support candidates, or they would support a candidate who would support raising the minimum wage. So I think the Democrats probably look at that heading into the midterm elections and see something to run with.
I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the moderate voters are also in support of that. Paul's part of that 58%, and whoever gets the moderates is the one that wins the next election.
And speaking of minimum wage in Canada, in Quebec, the province is right now facing more tough times. The Liberals won the election, have taken over. Mr. Couillard is now the
new premier.
The new premier of Quebec.
And he's been sort of handed a poisoned chalice, but in fairness, he knew that was coming, and he's actually been remarkably nonpartisan and nuanced in talking about the fact that the provincial deficit, which was already forecast by the Quebecois government to be $2.5 billion this year, will actually be $3.1 billion, $600 million more than anticipated. And it's almost it's a statutory requirement for a new government to then blame the previous government for irresponsibility and dishonesty. Mr. Couillard didn't do that. He just said previous governments have all had a hand in building up this culture of lack of spending restraint. In fact, he bent so far backwards that he may have been unfair, because actually the previous Liberal government did make a real effort and did manage to slow down the growth of spending quite effectively. But he made a point of not being partisan about it, and I guess that's just as well, because we're all going to have to face the pain from it now, Quebecois supporters and Liberal supporters alike. There are going to be immense cuts in government programs. It's hard to see exactly where they're going to get the cuts that they need to have. They're talking about slashing $3.7 billion from spending programs just this year alone. And even in a relatively large province with a big budget like Quebec's, that's a lot of money.
And you guys are already pretty heavily taxed, but
that's right.
They're not talking about raising taxes.
No, they made it clear that the one thing they're not going to do, or at least they're not looking at right now, is raise taxes, which is probably wise, because Quebec has probably already arrived at the point where an increase in taxes could be counterproductive in discouraging consumer spending and, more important, discouraging business investment. People just don't want to live in a province where they don't get to keep nearly as much money as they could if they lived right next door, say in Ontario or in the other end of the province in New Brunswick. So I mean, Quebec's got itself in a very serious competitive disadvantage, and the new government, I think, sort of understands that, and we'll see if they're able to make those cuts without cutting deeply into programs that people care about deeply. Essentially, education and the health insurance program make up most of government spending in most provinces. Quebec's no exception. So that's going to be pretty ticklish for them.
And you mentioned that this comes as no surprise to the new Liberal leadership. In fact, this has really become the norm over the past.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's right. Quebec has had a real big problem meeting its effort to balance the budget. It did so under a Parti Québécois government more than a decade ago, but it did so in a way that was somewhat dishonest, because there were massive buyouts of public service employees, which cut the operating budget and made the deficit look like it had gone away. But the buyouts, which came out of a kind of a capital budget and didn't show up in the deficit, were very expensive and left the province with a shortage of doctors and a shortage of nurses and a shortage of teachers in some crucial areas. So it wasn't a wise move over the long run. It's the kind of short-term thinking that a government does in order to try and make it through the next election cycle that we'll see if Mr. Couillard can break.
And you mentioned probably no new taxes, but are they looking at mass layoffs, teachers and other?
They're not looking at
healthcare
mass
workers?
layoffs yet, but that's more of an American state phenomenon. In Quebec, I think, or even elsewhere in Canada probably, that would just be considered a little crazy. You know, if you're not in the middle of the worst recession in history, you don't start laying off people en masse in the public service. But what they are doing right now is freezing hiring in the public service. And if Mr. Couillard is able to reform the public service, which will be a crucial way of keeping the budget under control, because Quebec has more civil servants per capita than any other province. And you know, part of that is because it has more social programs, but a large part of it is if you take the very same social program, it seems to take more people in Quebec to administer it. Quebec loves to have layer after layer after layer of administration. So you have the provincial layer, and then you'll have a regional layer, and then you'll have a local layer, and then finally you get down to people who are actually providing services to the public. If they can find a way of trimming that down very substantially, that would be a huge improvement.
And it comes at a time that certainly on this side of the border, people are looking north and seeing a lot of major capital projects, the Champlain
Yes.
Bridge and others. Would the funding already be in place for that, or could that funding like that be jeopardized by something like this?
I think funding for major capital projects is probably going to be looked at a lot more carefully, but that doesn't go in to calculate the deficit. That's a capital account. It's kind of stupid because it's real money and it's the very same kind of money, but that's the way they calculate it because it's an investment that pays for itself in a sense over 20 or 30 or 40 years. The Champlain Bridge itself, luckily, won't be a big problem for Quebec because that's a federal project. Any bridge over a navigable waterway is federal.
All right. On this side of the border, a bit of an uptick in home sales.
Thank goodness.
Yes.
The housing industry was supposed to be a major driver of the economic recovery beginning sort of a year ago or a bit more. And for a while it was. But then the increase in home sales just kind of petered out a bit and went into reverse for a number of months. And the number of pending home sales in the month of March, we just got the number, jumped by about a little over 3%, which is not a huge jump, but it was expected to just kind of stabilize or edge up 1%. So that's very encouraging because it had been going down. And indeed, it is still lower than it was a year earlier. But at least to have a turnaround more recently is an encouraging sign that the housing recovery hasn't just completely run out of steam. I think it was really just kind of cut off a little bit by the fact that mortgage rates, which had been at record lows, jumped pretty sharply last year, about a percentage point. And the lending rules for banks, the requirements for people's incomes and so forth, really haven't been relaxed that much since the banks clamped down after the housing collapse. They always like to clamp down and slam the door shut and lock it 5 different ways after the horses left the barn. So they did that, and now they're finally beginning to relax a little bit, but they haven't gone too far. Continued relaxation of those rules plus continued growth in employment should mean that the housing recovery will come back over the coming months, but maybe not as strongly as some people had expected.
Over the past.
On the other hand, Dodd-Frank, which is starting to be implemented and will be a phase-in over a number of years, is going to make some of that mortgage lending even more difficult. There's an awful lot more truth and disclosure rules and criteria. They really want to make sure that no sort of subprime or 100% mortgages will occur again.
True.
So that's going to move it in probably a counter-cyclical direction, unfortunately.
Indeed, I've read that rules like that are already having an impact and were a factor in part of the slowdown. It's harder to make liar loans, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And over the past 12 to 18 months, how much has this dragged on the rest of the economy, the housing?
Housing is critical. It's the single biggest item in the level of investment in our economy. And after the global financial meltdown, our economy went from an average annual investment rate around 17–18% to under 10%, which is a huge drop. We'd never seen a drop like that in our recent history. It's only now just starting to come back. So, and housing construction, new home construction is the single biggest component there.
New sanctions announced this week by the U.S. and the EU going after close associates of Russian President Vladimir Putin, trying to force Moscow to ease its intervention in eastern Ukraine. The ongoing standoff, has it created instability that is causing some concern about if this lingers on and the standoff continues, that it could have an impact on the European economy?
Certainly the European, we're probably more insulated from it here, but the Europeans are, agreeing with us kind of very reluctantly, and they're actually developing their own policies in tandem with some of the policies the U.S. government's developing. They're obviously very sensitive to their energy industry.
Politically agonizing for the government of Germany, because Angela Merkel, the German political leader, has made it pretty clear that she really is very, very upset to see this flagrant invasion of a neighboring country by Russia. On the other hand, Germany depends on links with Russia more than any other economy in Europe, and is very heavily dependent on imported gas and oil from Russia. Oil you can replace from other sources probably. Gas, not so easy. It's not easy to build a pipeline someplace else quickly, or to build liquefied natural gas receiving terminals. So what we see then is kind of a variation on the old joke about the concerned parent whose child is very, very sensitive, and so tells the teacher, if my kid does something bad, just slap the kid next to him. So that's what's happening to Mr. Putin. They're slapping the kid next to him occasionally, and they're not even slapping him very hard.
Europe gets, what, about 40% of its natural gas from Russia. And so there was talk this week that possibly they may try to replace that, or if that gets hung up, that they may turn to coal to try to replace at least some of that oil and gas coming from Russia.
Which goes exactly in the wrong direction with regard to greenhouse warming. The natural gas is still a hydrocarbon, but it's a heck of a lot cleaner and less CO2 producing for the same amount of energy content than coal is.
The best result in my mind would be if Germany were to reverse its very emotional decision to get out of nuclear power following the Fukushima disaster in Japan, and maybe just decide that the smart thing to do is to get out of badly built, unsafe nuclear reactors, but to recognize that nuclear reactors for baseline power, the kind of power that doesn't go away and when the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining, it's hard to beat nuclear. And there are now designs available for nuclear reactors that are pretty safe, pretty foolproof. But of course, that would be a costly and long-term investment. Something a little more encouraging was a story that surfaced in the last day or so about a deal between the Ukraine and Slovakia to reopen a disused pipeline that would enable Ukraine to import very large amounts of gas from Europe. Now, Europe doesn't produce a heck of a lot of natural gas, so maybe some of this would be liquefied natural gas being imported to someplace in Europe and then passed on to the Ukrainians. But since their natural gas from Russia has been increased in cost by something like 80% as part of the new political squeeze under Putin, maybe that would be a cost-effective way to take some of the pressure off.
And talking about energy, the other big news in the past week is this latest delay now in the approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. The State Department announcing last Friday, late in the afternoon, that's often when these type of announcements are made, that they don't want a lot of notice by the public. They'll be quietly released late in the Friday afternoon, but basically saying because of the ongoing litigation in Nebraska, the State Department saying it is unlikely that there would be any decision on the Keystone XL pipeline coming from the administration before the midterm elections. And I think a lot of people read into that.
Maybe it's dead. There are at least two objections that I can see to that as a Canadian who's not entirely unbiased, because a large part of Canada's economy is sustained by exports of energy. But it seems to me that the two objections I see are, number one, the Obama administration has behaved shamefully in terms of not really adhering to a process that you would expect under the rule of law, where you have a rule and you make a decision, and that's the decision. No decision, no decision, no decision, no decision. So it's the most painful and expensive and politically damaging possible response to Canada and to Canadian industry. It's been very harmful to the current government, a government I'm not real fond of, but still, it's caused some real political bitterness. And it's been very harmful to Canada's energy industry, which has been closely integrated with the United States and which is largely owned by American companies. So that's not a good idea. The second objection I would have is that it's not going to do anything about global warming. The comments of activists notwithstanding, it would be a great thing if you could shut down all high carbon sources of energy. That's certainly true. And heavy oil is a relatively high carbon source of energy. It's not anywhere near as bad as coal, but it is worse than regular conventional oil. But you can't shut it down unless you do something to shut it down directly. You can't shut it down by shutting down a particular pipeline, because oil can flow anywhere. It can flow to the United States on rail cars, which are much more dangerous, much more likely to spill oil or to explode than oil in a pipeline. It just seems a very foolish way to handle this from a public policy standpoint. Politics has completely trumped the public good, it seems.
And we would expect, would it seem, if the pipeline does not advance, that we would see even more of an increase in the amount of oil coming by rail into the U.S., bringing that heavier crude from the tar sands?
It would be very surprising if that didn't happen, yeah, because the oil's already being produced.
Well, at least a continuation of the pattern we've seen. We've seen a rapid acceleration of the amount of heavy oil coming in from either Canada or from North Dakota through this region over the last few years. Now, Canada's still going to get that oil out. It's probably going to go a little bit east through more traditional routes and west through new pipelines they're proposing to bring the oil to China. So the net effect on greenhouse gases worldwide is going to be insignificant in this gesture. I think you raise a good point. If we really want to look at a national energy policy with greenhouse gases in mind, we should identify the worst offenders, and you don't hear an awful lot of talk about cleaning up the coal industry. Mind you, it's political. They can't really afford to lose the votes in the coal exporting and coal burning states.
You are hearing more concerns raised about the oil that is coming, especially across the Canadian border and along Lake Champlain now to Albany. This is the lighter crude that's coming from North Dakota, more volatile than the heavier oil, and millions of gallons moving by rail down along Lake Champlain to Albany now, where it's being kept at a tank farm and then loaded on the barges and sent down the Hudson to refineries in New Jersey and beyond. The opposition seems to be forming in the Albany area. That tank farm wants to expand to start accommodating the heavier crude coming from Alberta by rail as well, and to heat that oil there to store it and keep it there, and some of the health concerns that may be affiliated with that, concerned about heating the oil, and the group seem to be using that as leverage now to try to stop the expansion of that tank farm to handle the additional crude. But for now, quite a bit of oil is going through the Champlain Valley and on its way to Albany and then onto the refineries. And the rails are regulated by the federal government, and so really, other than being prepared and trying to talk about the possibility of responding to spills or God forbid fires like we saw in Lake Champlain, there isn't much the communities can do as far as stopping that oil from moving.
That's right. In Essex County, just to the south of us, they're having discussions and forums on this, and I think we're starting to see that now, and more interest in Clinton County as well. But you're right, in the final analysis, there's not that much that can be done. Mind you, I think what we can do over the long term is encourage some of these rail lines to take a little bit less hazardous routes. For instance, in Plattsburgh, that oil comes right through the very heart of downtown, very much like a Lac Mégantic kind of scenario. From here, it goes right along rocky rail tracks right on the edge of Lake Champlain. If there's ever a derailment there, then we know where all of that oil is going. So we could have greater discussions in the long run, but not much can be done in the short run.
Congressional leaders are trying to push to get more emergency response plans, and of course they've been pushing to basically do away with the older tanker cars that have been deemed less safe, the DOT 111 tanker
big
cars.
improvement.
And we saw just within the past week, we mentioned just a little bit earlier in this program, we saw in the past week in Canada, where Transport Canada has taken definitive steps now to try to remove 70,000 over the next 3 years of these tanker cars, either remove them or get them retrofitted to improve the safety of the tanker cars hauling this oil.
The irony is that there's nothing you can do to tanker cars that will make them as safe as a pipeline, because they're rolling along the tracks, and if the tracks are damaged in any way, or God forbid if there's serious human error, as may have been the case in Lac Mégantic, then the tanker tanker cars will fall off the tracks, and there will be at least some spill. And that talk about the rail line going down right on the edge of Lake Champlain just made my heart sink. I wasn't aware of the route that rail line takes, but I can remember many happy summers spent with our family on the shores of Lake Champlain, and what a tragedy that would be if oil that was forced to be diverted onto the rail lines were to spill there.
And that is going to do it. That is our business edition for this month. We want to thank Colin and Jay, and thank you for watching. For all of us here at Mountain Lake PBS, I'm Tom Halleck. We'll see you next time.